Welcome to People and Profit. This week we're looking at race and economics. The global protests following the death of George Floyd have put a spotlight on racial disparities in the United States and around the world. The coronavirus recession has amplified many of those inequalities. In the US, even during good times, the unemployment rate for black people was around twice what it was for white people. Since the Covid-19 outbreak, the numbers have skyrocketed, bringing the unemployment rate for black Americans to 16.8% in May. For the Hispanic community, it's even higher. There's also a huge disparity in the wealth of typical households, with the median white household net worth being 10 times that of the median black household. That affects a family's ability to cope with job losses. To talk about this further, we're joined by Damon Jones, who's an associate professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Damon, thanks for being with us. We know that the mortality rate for black Americans has been much higher than for white Americans due to coronavirus. But what have the economic consequences been, and how has that been different for workers who are black and who are white?
The differences in economic outcomes are many, and they're kind of complex. I would say that we can start with the labor market, and we're seeing different patterns in unemployment across, let's say, racial groups during the pandemic. And there seems to be two different forces. One is that certain races in the United States, for example, Black and Latinos, are more likely to be in what we call essential jobs or to be frontline workers. They're disproportionately represented in those industries. So we actually saw a huge spike in unemployment, of course, as you're seeing in many places. But an interesting thing that you saw is that in normal times, the unemployment rate for, let's say, Black Americans typically is twice as large as it is for white Americans. During the pandemic, that ratio has gone down. And what that means is that because they're more likely to be frontline workers, they're disproportionately in the types of jobs that were not ended as quickly or as much as other jobs. And so you actually saw the ratio get closer together. But in normal times, that would be a good sign. But the downside is that they're in jobs that are typically low wage. They have a higher exposure to risk of infection. And these are jobs that typically have a low level of bargaining. And so they're typically being asked to come to work without being provided all the necessary safety measures that they need. And so you find yourself either facing unemployment or having to go to work and facing a higher risk of being infected. So it's a little bit of a catch-22.
You've recently been involved with research that's been looking at people's liquid assets, the money in their bank accounts, and that data was also broken down by race. What did you learn from that study?
Yeah, so what we looked at in that study is we know that there are large racial wealth gaps in the United States between Black and Latino households relative to white households. And so that was a pre-existing phenomenon at the onset of the pandemic. During the pandemic, you have people receiving less income or maybe being unemployed or furloughed, and so they're working less. And so you need to draw on liquid assets to make ends meet while you're have less resources coming externally. And so the lower level of liquid assets among Black and Latino households in this setting leads to a larger drop in spending on needed goods. So we looked at non-durable spending. So those are things that you need from day to day. So what you eat, groceries, things that you are going to buy and consume in a short period of time. And so we know that for the same economic shock, these households have a larger negative impact on their spending and what they can consume. And that's because of the lack of liquid assets. So these wealth disparities are going to exacerbate the negative shocks of losing your income or losing your job and things like that.
Are there policies that could be put in place that would help to reduce these inequalities as we come out and recover from this crisis?
Yeah, I think there are a number of policies, and it depends on what you're trying to bring more balance to. So in the labor market for these low-wage workers, in general, they could have maybe a better position bargaining with their employer. Easier ways to unionize and maybe have be able to negotiate better compensation and better working conditions. In terms of wealth, the differences in wealth across racial groups, the causes of those are many, and there also may have more recent factors like coming out of the last recession, but they also have very long-standing factors. So in the United States, historical factors related to racism, segregation, and things like that can be persistent and lead to long-standing, persistent differences in wealth. And so to close wealth gaps between these racial groups, I think is a much more complicated question. I don't think there's one policy answer that's going to be able to overcome that. You need to overcome different barriers in the job market, in education, and access to education, ways to accumulate wealth, and you also need to overcome barriers of racism. And so there are factors that lead to more segregation here in the United States and discrimination, and you need to overcome those factors as well.
Okay, Damon Jones from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, thank you very much for speaking to us. Now, here in France, official data on earnings and wealth aren't broken down by race because of a constitutional principle that all citizens should be equal before the law. However, the French government's human rights watchdog has issued repeated warnings over discrimination in hiring practices. A study published earlier this year found that when identical job applications were sent for thousands of positions, candidates with a name of North African origin received 20% fewer responses than those with a name considered to be of French origin. Let's speak now to Roland Ratelot, who's an associate professor of economics at Warwick University in the UK and has worked on research in this area. Roland, thanks for being with us. How does the lack of official data on ethnicity hinder research into inequality and employment in France?
So it's true that we don't have exactly the same kind of data in France that we can have in the UK or in the US, but it's not that we have absolutely nothing. So for instance, if you consider the official statistics or the data produced, the survey produced by the National Statistical Institute, we don't have race or ethnicity as such, but we use national groups. So for instance, where is your father, in which country is your father born in, and what nationality did they have at birth. So we can still have some kind of understanding of national groups, who is a first generation, second generation migrant, and work from there. And most of the studies that have been produced in France use this kind of information to infer ethnicity and ethnic gaps on the labor market.
So what does the research that's out there tell us about discrimination in hiring in France?
Right. So, I mean, there are two kinds of research, really. The first one is really trying to kind of measure the inequality. So if you look at the situation of the labor market, for instance, of second-generation migrants compared to native workers, what you see broadly is that there are huge raw differences. So especially if you consider people from North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, the raw differences are huge. So we're talking about a difference in employment rate of around 20 percentage points, and we're talking about 15% of wages. Yet, I mean, most of them can be explained by the fact that people of second-generation migrants, they actually are younger, and they also have less education, which is conducive to lower wages and lower employment rates. But still, once you control by all this, I mean, what you see is that there are still fairly large amounts of differentials in terms of employment, but for the wages, you kind of don't find any difference once you control by all this. So I would say that's the first kind of evidence we have. The second kind of evidence is, as you suggested, when you do correspondence studies. So you basically send two CVs to the same employer, one with Jean Dupont and the other one with a name sounding from, for instance, North Africa or Maghreb. And then you measure how the employers reply or don't reply to these applications. And you find quite important differentials also in terms of the reply they receive.
What does the disparities that exist in terms of hiring practices mean in terms of economic prospects for people who are a minority group in France?
So, as I said, I think there are some important differences at the moment when people send their applications and they have to put their names, because applications are, in their vast majority, not anonymous or not anonymized. And so that's conducive to receiving less replies from employer. And so they need to send basically more applications in order to receive something from employers, which in turn reduce their hiring, their employment rate. So I think this is conducive. We have evidence that discrimination at that stage, at the hiring stage, conduces to differences, to differentials in terms of employment. What is not very clear is how we can do that. So, for instance, there was a study talking about explicitly anonymizing resumes, but they have failed to kind of see that this was actually doing much good in terms of reducing inequalities across ethnic groups.
So what can be done to address this then?
Well, so I think what we can do is to try to understand really why these gaps emerge in the first place. So are we talking about really sheer racism? So basically just some kind of reaction that employers may have, or are we talking about stereotypes? So employers basically forging some kind of ideas about applicants based on their ethnicity, and then the question is really, how can we fight these stereotypes? Is it by reinforcing diversity within companies so that employers can, for instance, update their knowledge about working with minorities? Or is it actually by also helping minorities to show the talents and the skills they have, which is another way to kind of say, well, I'm a minority, but on all the other dimensions that you care about, I'm actually as productive as a native worker.
Okay, Roland Ratelot from Warwick University, thank you very much for joining us. And that's it from us for this week. Do get in touch on social media with your thoughts on this or the other stories that we've been covering. Until next time, thanks for watching.